All right. So thank you everyone for joining us today for our sixth session of our third season of Obliquity. If you haven't already met me, my name is Ashka and I'm a curator in Obliquity. Unfortunately, Manisha is unavailable to lead today's session, so I will be facilitating in her place. So I would now like to introduce Dr. Madhur Anand, a poet and an internationally recognized ecologist from the University of Guelph. Today, she will be reading from her experimental memoir, This Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart, which is also the winner of the 2020 Governor General's Literary Award for Nonfiction. So from what I understand, Dr. Anand, as an adult, you did not know very much about your parents' lives, and this book was written to explore that part of your family through generational storytelling and the use of different lenses, including history, science, and poetry. And so without further ado, I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Ashaka, and thank you to Obliquity, to Manisha, for inviting me to participate in your series. What a wonderful idea! What a wonderful gathering of people and topics and lives. Um, yeah, I'm going to read to you from the memoir. I'll just say a few words about it to begin with, and hi everybody. There's not too many of us here, so it's enough that hopefully we can get to know each other. um, I'm in terms of the structure for the time that we have together. I will talk about the book a little bit. I'll read from it a little bit, and then um, I think we can just initiate a conversation. I find that yeah, any sort of question that anybody wants to ask about the topics that we're here to share today will usually lead to quite a lengthy monologue on my part. Um, but I'm very curious to hear what your interests are, because we do have such a diverse group here, and I want everybody to get something out of it. Um, in terms of their own interests and why you're here. So I am a poet. I am an ecologist. Um, for your curiosity, and I can talk more about this later. I became a scientist sort of first in the sense that I only started writing my first poems in the final stages of writing up my PhD in theoretical ecology at Western. Um, you know, was I a poet before then? I think I was, but that was the point at which I started to write poems. And at the moment in my life where I decided to take poetry and creative writing seriously. And then that led to the publication of my first book of poems a long time after that, which is called A New Index for Predicting Catastrophes. That was published in 2015. And then, in fact, shortly after that book came out, my mother had a heart attack, and it was the first sort of moment in her life where her we felt her life was threatened and that we could lose her, and that was quite an awakening moment for me as an adult. Because I realized, you know how I guess they say, like, when you face mortality, your life flashes before your. I mean, that's never happened to me. I've never faced mortality myself like that, but um, it was when my mother faced mortality that the her life flashed through my head or brain or before my eyes, except that I realized that it was blank. It was a blank screen. Like, I didn't know anything other about her other than how she was as my mother. So um and that was like, just sort of little factual things, like the name of the town where she was born, for example. And to me, that like in one generation, I felt that was just, it was absurd. Like it suddenly seemed absurd. And then of course with her facing, she's alive still, but with her facing mortality at that time, I realized that I wanted to get I wanted to know these things before it was too late, so to speak. So but I had just finished publishing my first book of poems, and I was just sort of taking down, I began to record their stories for the first time, to write them down at first. And then when I realized that it was going to be too hard to just make notes based on memory of things that they had told me, or just have them sitting in front of me and me take notes, I started to record our conversations. And so at first I started to just record our conversations, like just imagine, like just our normal interactions, like when I would go to visit, I would have my my recorder on, um, and just sort of record the exchanges. Um, and then I think that was just to kind of get a, just get a feel for what, I don't know, I guess it was just, wanting to somehow preserve the time that we had together. But then it slowly morphed into actively interviewing them to get certain points, certain facts, certain dates, places, and then eventually other details like um, their perceptions of their surroundings and what they did and where they went, and names of people and so on and so forth, names of trees and species and names, various different things. So that's what happened. That's sort of how it evolved through a medical moment. I know that this is a medical series in the hospital. It was in fact looking, it was one of those kind of weird scenes where I am looking at a diagram that the cardiologist is showing me, and it's just this black and white drawing. It's almost like a drawing that you would see in a children's coloring book. And it was a drawing of her heart and all of the, veins and arteries, and where the blockage was and what they had done. And, he had colored it in with pen, where the blockage was colored in pen. And I don't know, maybe that just threw me back to childhood or something like that. And I just, as I was looking at that, you know, there was another part of my brain that was saying, this is not my mother. This is not my mother. This diagram of her heart is not her heart. And so that was sort of that moment. All right. So eventually, so what it evolved into over many years, because I started thinking about it in 2015, and this book was published in 2020, was a set of stories. I had to figure out then how to turn those kind of that raw transcript of stories and conversations that extended a period of 80 years, because it starts in their childhood in pre-partition India, and then it goes to present, to 2019. And so that process took quite a huge transformation and translation. And but what it amounted to is a book that has two sides. So this is the front cover that you see, and I decided in the end to tell the stories in the first person, in their voices. So the stories alternate, starting with my mother's voice, then in one chapter, then my father's voice, then my mother's voice. It alternates. And it starts from their childhood to almost, and then it ends almost present. But when you get to about the halfway point of the book, we've inserted some documents from their lives that I've and then you get some upside down stuff. So you realize that you actually have to flip the book over, and then there's a second part to the book, which is stories told in the first person by me, I'm the character, so to speak. And so there's a number of stories there that also go from childhood to adulthood. And the stories were, I guess, chosen, or they sort of, it's not my whole life that's told in that side, but it's sort of like if you take all their stories and put them into a sieve and then sort of sift it out and see what's left. Those are the stories that I feel like are represented by the ones that are on my side. That's to say that they all kind of echo back to what I've written in the first part, either directly or indirectly. A lot of things work through metaphor in the book because I am a poet. So, and that's very, that I use that a lot. But that's also to say that it's not a classical memoir in that it's really not about my life, if that makes sense. So we call it a memoir in halves. We called the project a memoir in halves because there's lots of parts of my life that are not in there because they just didn't feel part of this particular project. So it's a really hard book to describe. I mean, because it is a poetic work. But that's an introduction. And then what I'm going to do is to read to you something from in my father's voice, which is to say also my voice because I wrote it on his behalf, but I'm embodying him. And then I'm going to read you something from my side, and you'll hear immediately the relationship between the two pieces and between the two sides. Okay? All right. I would go to the McGill University campus now and then to inquire about academic positions. By then it was February 1968. I carried with me a manila envelope with photocopies of all my education certificates. No one would even meet with me, acknowledge my presence. One day, a secretary who recognized me from my previous visits told me to try Sir George Williams University, just down the road. They are much more lenient with people like you, she said. They take all kinds. McGill still had quotas for immigrant students, including Asians, Blacks, and Jews. Later that day, I left copies of my degrees with the main office of Sir George Williams on de Maisonneuve Boulevard. I was told to come back the next day to see a Dr. Sharma. I returned first thing in the morning. The office door was closed, but that did not stop me from knocking. Dr. Sharma was seated behind a desk, the entire right wall filled with books, the entire left wall a chalkboard. I introduced myself in about 5 sentences in Hindi. So you want to do a PhD? Yes, sir. So what then? You got third class in your MSc? No, sir. I got first class. From Delhi University? Yes, sir. What are you doing here? This is a third-rate university. You should go to McGill. I tried, sir. Okay, join these 2 courses here and we will give you an equivalent of MSc when you are done. What about the fees, sir? He picked up the phone and asked his graduate students if they needed any help in lab instruction. Yes, a couple of days a week, 4 hours a day, $6 an hour. That totaled $48 per week. I had won the lottery. It was enough to pay for rent and for everything. The 2 courses I had to take were Quantum Mechanics 3 and Solid State Physics. Dr. Sharma taught the quantum mechanics course himself. One day the lecture was on neutron scattering. Dr. Sharma had started to review the relationship between the particle and wave viewpoints and how neither were correct. The neutron behaves like a particle when created, and like waves when scattered, and then like a particle again when detected. He explained that the probability of finding a particle is proportional to the absolute square of the amplitude, but that the amplitude itself varies with position and time. He explained that the neutron interacts with matter in two ways: strong nuclear forces with nuclei and dipole-dipole coupling with magnetic moments. He had started to write down the equations for the complex plane wave of nuclear neutron scattering from a single fixed atom when he stopped. He was stuck right in the middle of the class, right in the middle of the board, right in the middle of the equation. Let us continue tomorrow, he said. I asked if I could try. I limped to the front of the classroom, took the white chalk, and began to complete the equations, matching my handwriting as close as possible to Dr. Sharma's. Dr. Sharma called me into his office after class. You know all this? He asked me a couple of more questions. Can one measure elastic scattering from a liquid? What is incoherent scattering? Bragg diffraction, time of flight, Larmor precession. I answered them all. He told me not to bother coming to class anymore and said I got an A. Things felt strained after that with Dr. Sharma. I applied to do a PhD at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. 2 weeks later, I got a letter. I was admitted with a $3,700 a year scholarship. Not just the lottery, but the jackpot. No coursework required. But I did not go. Why? Maybe the Rocky Mountains intimidated me. The ball just settled on a no. I tossed a coin and it was tails. There was a job being advertised by the Catholic School Board. One of their physics teachers was sick. The principal was a father. There was a box on the job application form for religion. I filled out everything except that box. The father gave it back to me and said I forgot to complete one part. Sir, do you want me to indicate the one I was born in or the one I believe in? So I'll stop there, and then I'm gonna flip it over, and I'm gonna read to you something from a later part. It's a chapter called Alpha Decay Office Hours. So that was my father's voice, obviously, and now this is me. There's an epigraph to the chapter. It has hitherto been necessary to postulate some special arbitrary instability of the nucleus, but in the following note it is pointed out that disintegration is a natural consequence of the laws of quantum mechanics without any special hypothesis. Much has been written of the explosive violence with which the alpha particle is hurled from its place in the nucleus, but from the process pictured above, one would rather say that the alpha particle almost slips away unnoticed. And that's from a physics paper by Gurney and Condon. I arrive at the Montreal office half an hour before office hours begin. He arrives at the same time from the opposite direction. I say hello and my name. He unlocks the door. I'm here early, I start. He enters, puts the briefcase down, removes an Indian-style fur hat, fox, I think. He hangs the hat and his brown sheepskin coat on the coat rack. I mimic him, taking off my own coat but putting it on the chair beside me. He sits down behind his desk. Only then does he speak. Let's start. But I cannot start like that. It is too late to offer a handshake or a hug or other formalities or niceties. Still, I muster up a half-hearted namaste, putting my hands together, the only thing left for me to do, which is strange because I never namaste. Maybe he sees that. I reiterate my project goals and ask him to start by remembering 1967, the year he met my father. He does so naturally, his memory in this matter intact, an alpha particle decay, but in reverse. Dr. Sharma confirms that he told my father, who wanted to join the department as a graduate student when he first arrived as an immigrant to Canada, to go to a better university. But he then tells me a few things that do not match my father's story. That he was never the supervisor of my father's PhD research, that he was never my father's mentor, that my father only went to 2 or 3 classes in his courses and never returned, that he hardly had any interactions with him. It was instead a Jewish professor my father worked for who was his supervisor. The things that do not match what my father remembers do not seem to matter in and of themselves, and yet I have stumbled onto a problem I cannot apply to the scientific method to. What do you do when you know something is untrue, but you cannot prove it? How can you tell the difference between a failing memory and a delusion? Which facts belong to whom? The electromagnetic forces become stronger than the nuclear forces. The alpha particle escapes through a tunnel and joins another nucleus. The truth slips away unnoticed. So I will stop there. And yeah, I think maybe just pause and perhaps like start a conversation with you, with some of you. And then if and when it becomes like, if it makes sense, I will read some more. I'll read more from the memoir, or I can also read you things from my poetry manuscript as well.
I have a question. So I'm just curious, and maybe you addressed this and I missed it, but was it in your interview with your father and capturing that story that inspired you to go find this professor and interview him? Or had you already done that? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's interesting. It's a good question. It could have gone either way. In this case, I interviewed my father first. So he told me all those stories first. And then I tried to reach out to, like, it's not that I was, it wasn't part of my project to try to validate everything that my mother or father were telling me. And I should clarify that it was actually probably part of my project to not validate anything. I would really put it that way. I consciously did not want to, validate or invalidate anything. I wanted their stories to speak for themselves. I wanted them to have their own voices. And so my mother's stories appear as she told them. My father's stories appear as he told them. And there are instances in that first part of the memoir where you'll read, you'll read like the same place, the same time, but from two different perspectives. One is my mother's and one is like sometimes the same house, right? The very same room, but in one chapter it'll be told from my mother's voice and another from my father's voice, and you'll see the great distance in that, in those perspectives. So in this particular case, I did find out, I actually just sort of one day out of curiosity, I just wondered if this Dr. Sharma was still around. So I looked up the website for the physics department at Concordia, and there was a Dr. Sharma listed there, but there was no photograph. And I thought, well, okay, you know, chance, it could be him, but it could also be any other, like Sharma's a really common name. So I thought, well, let me just email this person. So I emailed this person out of the blue. I just introduced myself very briefly. I said, I am this person's daughter. Um, I have a few questions about, about Concordia and about his time there. And he never wrote back. Nobody ever wrote back. And then many, many, many weeks later, I wrote again. And I think I might have said a tiny bit more about why I was contacting him and why I wanted to potentially meet. Actually, no, I was going to Montreal. I think I fibbed and said that I was going for some reason, professional reason, but I was just gonna go. I wanted to go and meet him. So I said, I'm gonna be in Montreal on such and such weekend. Will you, can I come and see you in your office? And then he wrote right back and said, yes, come on Friday at 1 p.m. That's it. And he's 90 years old and he's still working as a physics professor. So at that point, I thought I didn't know, I didn't necessarily think that anything that I was going to do or find out would appear in the book, but that's sort of how the whole book came about anyway. I never really knew what was going to end up in the book. I was just sort of doing things, and I did a lot of things on a whim like that, related directly to my parents and also not related to my parents. Like there's another part where I talk about just getting up and going to New York City, to Brooklyn, to the museum, because I saw that they were having an exhibit of Frida Kahlo's paintings, but also her wardrobe. And there was this image they were using to advertise the show, which was a photograph of her shoes that were, the heel was higher on one boot than the other, because she did have polio, childhood polio, and then she was in an accident. And anyway, she had to have these special orthotic made. And when I saw the picture, it just randomly came into my inbox, an advertisement for the museum. They looked like my father's polio shoes. And so I was like, okay, that's enough of a coincidence for me to go to New York City. And that story of going there and what I experienced by just going to see that show, is also in the book. So yeah. So anyway, to answer your question, yeah, the Sharma visit was afterwards, but then I didn't know what to expect. And yeah, and it ended up becoming a story in the book.
Thank you for sharing that. That is fascinating.
To follow up to that, so is your father still living?
Mm-hmm.
Did you go to your father afterwards and tell him of your visit to Dr. Sharma?
No.
Has he read the book?
I think so.
You're not certain?
He hasn't really talked to me about the details of the book. They have it. I've given it to them. They've had it for a long time. No, I did tell him that I went to visit him. I did tell him that. It's coming back to me now. But I told him that I went to visit him, but I didn't necessarily say, oh, he said that you didn't do that or that. I mean, it wasn't important. And he didn't ask. My father didn't really ask about that. And it wasn't really important. He was interested in other things, like And that's how it is. I'm interested in very different things than they are, and that's how it is. And that's partly why what motivated it, the whole memoir in the first place, that there are these differences from one generation to another. My father was just interested in, the fact that they took me out for dinner, because after I spent hours in Dr. Sharma's office, despite the awkwardness in the beginning and his sort of like, he didn't quite want to open up to me and talk to me. And I write about this in the book, that he it's like he didn't really want to talk to me, but he also didn't want to ask me to leave. And I don't think he was just being polite. I think it was just that kind of I don't know, tension. I think sometimes we all carry, like, of wanting to do something but not quite wanting to do it. And I ended up staying for hours in his office talking with him. And then it got late and he invited me to come home to his home and meet his wife. They took me out for dinner to an Indian restaurant in Montreal. And my father was interested in that, in those aspects. Yeah.
Sorry, this will be my last question. Has your relationship with your mother and father changed, any of the dynamics since writing your memoir?
Well, it has, but for, there's other things that have compounded it. One, the pandemic, because the book came out in June 2020, and those were the days where, like, we could not even see them, right? So, and then my and then my mother had another very serious fall, unfortunately, that summer, and a stroke. And so she's now, and it's just sort of slowly deteriorating. And she can no longer talk very well. I mean, she's still very cognizant of everything, and her memory is still intact, but she can't talk and can't really walk. So the relationship has changed, but not so much because of the book. So it's terribly sad. I don't know, but the reality is that, like, if I wanted to start doing this project today, I couldn't. I wouldn't be able to, because she cannot speak. So somehow I did end up doing it before it was too late. And I have all her voice memos, which I haven't listened to, but I was just thinking the other day that because, she can barely speak now. And but, I don't know. I mean, probably everybody has experienced something in their lives, whether it's a grandparent or what. But it's happened it's happened in a relatively, like, the decline has been progressive, but so we've been adapting to it and grieving all along, and you've almost forgotten, like, it's just become sort of normal, right? And then you sort of forget what it was like before. But it suddenly dawned on me, actually, just, I think, the last visit that I had with them, that I had all these voice memos of her. Like, I actually have her voice speaking. They're there. So it's going to serve another purpose, I think, just to have those recordings.
Hearing you talk about how there were a separateness and distinctiveness to the stories, and the stories were the same. I think it's just brilliant the way the book was published. And I was curious to know if you had any difficulties with your agent or the publisher, or if you ran up against any opposition to having the book published the way it is.
No, because the decision to do it this way only came after I had already sold the book, so to speak. So I got the contract to write the book based on about 4 or 5 essays that I had written, so it wasn't complete. So I hadn't imagined it. I didn't know it was going to be like that. I mean, I didn't know it would turn out like this. So it was something that evolved. And one of the nice things is that the imprint that that published it, it's a big publisher, but the imprint is relatively new, and it's called Strange Light. And their mandate is to publish like boundary pushing, edgy books. So they were, I think, I mean, they sort of said this from the beginning, like that, you know, you can do whatever you want, you know, and so I think it was the right fit in that sense. But I think it was bold, like it was bold for them to do it this way. I don't know, like now it just seems like a lot of books could be written like this, because there's a lot of books that have like a duality to them. And I've actually been looking myself to see now what examples of other books there are like this out there. I haven't found too many, but I think that there's a couple that I've come across that have similar ideas, but I only like people told me about it afterwards. One of them is a book by Carol Shields called Happenstance. It's a novel that you read it one way and it's the wife's version of the marriage, and you read it the other way and it's the husband's version of the marriage, so to speak. But I'm not sure, it's not a flip book. I'm not sure how it's actually structured. I haven't seen the hard copy. And there's a couple of others that I've noticed, but not very many. Oh, there's a book by Ali Smith, the writer Ali Smith, and it's called How to Be Both, which has a really fascinating structure where, but these are both fiction, where you start okay, so that's an interesting book because it was actually published with 2 different covers. But linearly, like, you see what I mean? So it would have been like if I had this book, but everything was linear, like you didn't have to do the flip, right? It was like part 1 and then part 2. And then, so half of the books were printed that way for Ali Smith's book, and then half of the books were printed this way. Like, so it was truly like you don't know which is the right way. And it was just like lottery, whether you would go into a bookstore, whether you would find, you know, one side first and the other. And the flip for her book is really interesting. I don't know if I should give it away. Well, no, if you read the summary of it, I'm sure it would say this, that one half of the book is told from the perspective of a young girl, a teenager, reflecting back on, I think, the illness and or death of her mother. I think the death of her mother. And then her mother was an art historian. And so at the end of her section, she goes to an art museum and is looking at a painting painted by a 15th century Italian painter. And she's staring at it and she's sort of remembering what her mother told her about it. And then that's the end of part 1. And then part 2 is the painter starts speaking and is looking at the girl, looking at him. And he's like contemplating the girl looking at him. And then and then the whole second part tells the story from the perspective of this 15th century Italian painter. So anyway, it's happened before. I didn't know about either of those, when I was writing my book. I only learned about them afterwards. But it seemed natural. It seemed really natural and obvious to do it this way. I'm surprised that nobody else has written a memoir this way.
So Dr. Nand, I have a question, but I
Yes.
just wanted to say that what you described, the current state that you're living with your mother right now, it resonates with me because my grandmother is sort of in a similar state where she's been experiencing a bit of progressive decline over the years. And from what you said, it makes me wish that I had the foresight when I was younger to speak with her about her past, because I could have gotten a much more in-depth look at my family history through that oral storytelling that I don't know if I'll be able to get from her perspective now. So that's a loss for me. But my question relates to the beginning when you read through your father's chapter. And when you spoke about him going to McGill to seek that position, I feel like that part resonated with possibly that collective immigrant experience,
Yeah.
especially for highly educated immigrants where they struggle to find validation in Canada or the United States, for instance. And I was wondering if you could speak to perhaps some of the other barriers your parents may have faced when they immigrated to Canada.
Everything was a barrier. But there were barriers all their lives, right? So like I trace what I can gather. So first of all, just to speak to the thing about your grandmother, I mean, you're certainly not alone. I feel like, the gap between like two generations is so much larger. I never even met many of my grandparents. They died before, I was born, or they were living in India or whatever. So it's a huge gap, and you're not alone there across those two generations. I would encourage you to talk to your mother more. You could probably, I mean, if you want, um, it's a strange thing to say, talk to your mother. Like, it sounds so simple and derivative, but the trick is, like, I mean, everybody has different relationships with their parents and has different levels of ease or disease, with speaking with their parents. But I think after a while, I think this is a common experience of second generation immigrants, like, I guess us. I don't know if your parents were born in Canada or not, but is that it is a little bit difficult to talk to them in a certain way. It's very easy to talk to them in some ways, but in other ways it's very difficult. So it is very difficult to talk to them about I don't know certain things. So what I would find is that this project made me talk to them in a completely different way. So if you want to hear different things, you have to kind of come at it from a different angle. This is general writing advice, basically. um, you know, um, so you have to kind of find that angle, maybe, and then or like maybe simply asking your mother about your grandmother might be enough of the angle, right? Where she sort of suddenly shifts the gaze, right? She shifts the gaze from being your mother and that you're her child to herself, perhaps, or to her, so that's just one way. And so for me, I was finding that, like, over the years, having my own children and going home, like, the conversations tended to stay within a particular domain and not go any, like, it was always almost as though we were having the same conversations over and over again. Like, how many times have you called your mother and the conversation is, what did you do? What did you eat for lunch? What'd you make for dinner? And that's it. And it just sort of like variations on that, right? Whereas this project allowed me to, you know, what was the color of your bicycle when you were 15? You know, what was the, like, it's almost turning it on its head. And then suddenly, so yeah. And then, you know, if you don't have time to write it down, just record it for future use, right? Okay, so I'll leave that part. And then the second part about the immigrant experience, I mean, yeah, so I think that's partly, you know, why the book can resonate with many second generation immigrants from anywhere. Because it does, you know, there are a lot of common experiences there. I mean, there's a reason why there's one word for that very broad category of person, immigrant. And so, yeah, there's a lot of instances of that people will be able to resonate with. In particular, you know, they're coming from India to Canada. I write about, well, my father came over first without my mother. So I think that sometimes is also a common thing, because one person kind of has to establish, like, get a job and find a place to live before bringing over family members. And I've always found that kind of distancing, you know, that still happens today. Like, I remember when I was in grad school, one of the other graduate students in the lab was from China, and she came over to do her PhD, and like she left her husband and son in China and was here for a year. And I thought, you know, wow, how can you do that? So anyway, my dad came over first, my mother was left behind, and yeah, everything. He came here, he didn't know anybody. He didn't have a coat, didn't have a winter coat. He arrived in winter. I mean, it's all like sort of usual things. And, you know, it's definitely part of the narrative throughout. But, you know, even just rewinding back to their lives as children, they were both part of the partition of India. So they both had to leave their childhood homes when India was partitioned into well, when Punjab, the region of Punjab where they were living, was partitioned into India and Pakistan, and India gained independence from British rule. They were kind of on the wrong side of that Radcliffe line and had to migrate, right? So there's all kinds of hardships, I guess, and difficulties that they yeah, that I describe. Mm-hmm.
I had a comment too. I just want to say I really appreciated what you were sharing about how your goal wasn't really to validate what your parents had told you, like how the facts weren't necessarily the point. And I really like resonated with that because I'm a medical student, and this is my first rotation where I'm in the hospitals full time. And I've been noticing a couple times where I'll be having this conversation with a patient, and I feel like I'm learning so much, and then they say something really confidently, and then when I get collateral information, it's like, no, that's not true at all about the patient or about their history or about their
Interesting.
Yeah, and I'm finding it, I guess, frustrating in a medical context where like the facts are important for diagnosing someone and really knowing what's up with their body. But I really appreciate, like, I don't know, you've made me think about what other purposes might there be in asking people questions about themselves other than knowing their factual history. And I feel like another purpose is to know them, like know who they are, what their perception of themselves is, and to get a sense of, yeah, just their remembered experience, and I don't know what that says about their heart. I'm having trouble putting words to it. So I was wondering if you had any more thoughts about that, about like, what is the alternative goal when asking someone's story, instead of like, okay, the point isn't the fact, so what is sort of the point?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I feel we should just leave that question open because it's even though you say you were at a loss for words, it was really beautifully articulated. Because you like expressed what you're feeling and what you confronted. And I think that just that's enough. Like that says it all. um, um, I don't think we can answer. I don't think we should answer that because I think that's actually the point, right? That they're that they're you know that we don't have to know the goals in how we like relate to one another. Right? And how we and stories, poetry, fiction, even nonfiction, which my book is nonfiction, but I did really wanted to write it in a way to eschew like the kind of conventions of nonfiction, the normal conventions of nonfiction, which is to get all the facts right and like a journalistic type of style of investigating things. I investigated, but it was for the purpose of discovery, for sure. I discovered a lot in my process. But there wasn't a single objective and a single endpoint or a single the only word that comes to me is actually a technical term for modeling, and it's called an attractor. When you do modeling, the simplest models have just single stable state attractors, and so regardless of I studied these models in my PhD. They're called Markov models, and the dynamics are such that like you start at one point and then you sort of approach some final point, like you get closer and closer to it. That's what the dynamics looks like. Every step, like you take one step, the next step is a little bit closer, the next step is a little bit, it's like a Doppler, a kind of inverse Doppler. And so those are simple models that have single attractors, and the feature of them is that it doesn't matter where the initial condition is in that model, you will always end up at that same point because it's just math. Transition probabilities stay the same. So I studied those and I thought that was really interesting. But most complex dynamics and in complex systems, there's no such thing as a stable attractor. So kind of the next level of complexity is to have something called like with two attractors. So it has bistability. You're like, so many people are nodding their heads here. So this is pretty cool that you guys have experienced some mathematical modeling, systems modeling. So you have these two attractors. So it will go to either one or the other, depending on the initial conditions. So that's already very exciting because you have two options, two outcomes, two possible outcomes. But most models, many models have multiple attractors. And so like chaotic dynamics, which is maybe something you've heard about from chaos theory, it can have one of the most complex kind of attractors out there where you can have many possible states. And that's the best analogy, I would say, for the type of writing that this represents. Yeah. And I don't know how it would apply to you speaking with your patient on a practical level, but I'm sure that like because I don't have any experience as a physician, I only have experience as a patient, and yeah, I mean, we're all human, right? At the end of the day, right? We're not Yeah, and I mean, I would really wish for some of you to speak more about the role of narrative in medicine and the role of stories in medicine, because I can only speak of it from the position of like a scientist poet. Yeah, I'm looking at the chat and there's a lot of really great points here about, like, there's just so many different ways of getting to an endpoint. That's another probably important thing to say. So, the title of my book is This Red Line Goes Straight to Your Heart, which is such a strange concept in a way. Like, how can a line go straight to a heart? Is there such a line? There's no, and well, and is the path straight? Is it linear? Like, can something go somewhere more quickly or directly if it's not going through a linear path, right? And so you can think about, like, and that's, I think, ultimately what metaphor does, what poetry can do, and I think those can be really powerful. And so I hope I'm making some sense here, right? Like, we're like to compare, a logical, or what we think is a logical, perhaps scientific, factual approach to reaching a particular conclusion, when humans are involved, right? I think that as humans, there are many more indirect, but maybe faster ways of getting to the point, getting to the conclusion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anand. So I believe this brings us to the end of our session. And I just want to thank you, Dr. Anand, for leading this wonderful reading and discussion. And I want to thank everybody again for attending and supporting Obliquity. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Manisha, or contact our Obliquity email or any of our social media pages. And stay tuned and follow our website to see when our next workshop is. Thank you so much, everybody.